press was irresponsible to say the thing that was true about Jason Arday.
We don't know what was going through his mind. Low-quality research is not misconduct per se. His status is something that you can't buy.
On August 14th, 2026, news broke that Jason Arday had been found dead at his home in London. His cause of death is still unknown, but his family blamed what it called a sustained campaign of abuse and misinformation, the culmination of a controversy that, in a matter of weeks, had transformed Arday from one of Britain's most celebrated academics into the subject of intense public scrutiny. So how did we get here? Because in 2023, at the age of 37, he became the youngest Black professor in the history of Cambridge University, after a remarkable rise through academia that was often told as a story of overcoming endless difficulties, not just racial discrimination, but a brain tumor, autism, developmental delays. Then, this summer, that story began to unravel. Nathan Kofnes, a former Cambridge researcher, raised questions about Arday's academic research. Soon, there were allegations of plagiarism in his doctoral thesis, along with questions about other claims Arday had made about his athletic career and other parts of his biography. Arday denied plagiarism, though he acknowledged mistakes in his doctoral work. But that didn't stop the controversy, which spread from blogs and social media into the British press, then to the American press, and eventually Cambridge had to open an investigation. Arday resigned from his professorship. Days after his resignation, he was dead. And almost immediately, the fight over what and who had brought things to this point began. And that's the part I want to talk about today, not simply whether Jason Arday did things that deserved scrutiny, but who bears responsibility for what happened before the scandal, what happened once it began, and what this story tells us about the way institutions handle questions of merit, race, accountability, integrity, and scandal. Joining me for this conversation is Gabriel Rossman. He is a professor of sociology at UCLA who studies institutions, culture, and how reputations and disreputable behavior operate in social systems. He's informed a lot of my own thinking about civil rights, DEI, and the very delicate problem of integrating institutions. So when I found myself trying to make sense of the Jason Arday story, who failed, who bears responsibility, and what this tragedy tells us about the institutions involved, Gabriel was the person I most wanted to think it through with.
And I just wanted to offer a quick content note before we begin. This episode includes mentions of sexual assaults and suicides, so if you have kids in the car or if you're sensitive, you might want to save this for later or skip it entirely. And with that, Gabriel, welcome to the show.
So I want to start with what might seem like an absurdly obvious question, which is, why does Jason Arday's story matter? Why should we care about his story, and why did we care so much about this story?
We cared about the story because somebody bothered to accuse him. And I mean that in the sense that one of the things we know from the sociology of scandal is that scandal isn't about transgression. Scandal is about accusation. That you can have long periods where there's something absurd or wicked or just not quite right. And as long as nobody forces you to pay attention to it, people just can kind of look the other way. And so the classic example of this would be the Bill Cosby scandal, where it's kind of weird to remember now, but there was a period, relatively brief period, but there was a period where it was kind of common knowledge, and not just like, oh, if you're a Hollywood insider and you'd been to the Ivy, you would know this, but like just everybody who is a reasonably frequent newspaper reader would know that Bill Cosby had a long series of sexual assault accusations, but we all kind of ignored it until Hannibal Buress put it in his act and made a regular part of his act where he would talk about Cosby's respectability politics and all his, his pound cake speech and that sort of thing. And then Buress would keep coming back to his punchline. And what Buress was doing there is he was forcing people to say, I'm not allowing you to not care about this. I'm forcing you to have an opinion on this. And because rape is a very serious accusation, once he makes salient and forces you to confront the issue, it becomes something that becomes scandalous. So in the same kind of way, Arday's CV is plain to see. You can go on Google Scholar right now and look it up. You can come to your own opinion, but people could just kind of could choose to ignore it until Arday faced accusers. And he was actually pretty good at shutting down those accusers. First, there was an accusation from colleagues, and then there was an accusation from Times Higher Education. He was able to use these resources to effectively shut those down. And then you had somebody who basically had nothing to lose, Nathan Kaufness, who made the accusations public, right? Arday was able to prevent Times Higher Education from running their story through threat of a libel suit.
And also calling the police to and accusing the reporter of harassment, which sort of, for basically just calling him, right? It wasn't like the reporter was standing out in front of him and shouting epithets at him. He just kept calling to ask about this dossier they had, and he shut it down with a police suit, basically.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, if you as a journalist were to send me questions that I didn't especially like by email, I might say, I'm not answering any further questions, but I'm not going to call the police on you unless I, find you pick the lock to my apartment or something. He faced these accusations from Kaufness, who made them public. And then by making them public, he kind of created common knowledge around the situation where it's not enough that I know and you know, but I know and you know that I know. So that kind of like recursive thing of common knowledge is an important part of a dam breaking on something that everybody kind of knows, but we're all kind of afraid to say it, maybe because we're afraid of being reported to the police, maybe because we're afraid of a racism accusation, maybe because we're afraid of a libel suit, whatever. But Kaufness making it public kind of broke the dam. And then from there, you saw the story spiral, where first right-wing mainstream newspapers picked up the story, and then left-wing mainstream newspapers in the UK picked up the story, and then, center-left and mainstream newspapers in the US picked up the story. And then finally, Cambridge said, okay, we'll do an investigation. So that's basically why it became a scandal. Now, there's the other question of like, why were people so interested in this? Like, why was it scandalous and not just like, well, because it was an accusation, but why did the accusation catch on? Why did people care about that accusation? And you have to start with the immense prestige that Cambridge has. I mean, obviously in the UK, they talk about Oxbridge as like their equivalent of the Ivy League. And even in the US, we recognize that Oxford and Cambridge are a big deal. And just generally, people tend to care about elites. Where do elites come from? What are elite producing institutions? Whenever you do a story on education, I'm sure many times you've done stories on education and you've gotten some type of comment of saying, why are you talking so much about Harvard? The typical college student lives at home, takes 5 years to go to their local state school. And it's like, I kind of get it, right? That is kind of a reasonable critique. And you certainly wouldn't want to say that the issues at Harvard, or for that matter, the issues at Cambridge, are the issues that define higher education in the United States. But for very good reasons, people care about where our elites came from. So when you hear something happened at Cambridge, you really care. And also people kind of know, like, this is where Isaac Newton worked, and, they have all these Nobel laureates and things. So Cambridge's immense prestige was a big part of this. And then the contrast between Cambridge's immense prestige, both in the UK and the US, and the just to be blunt about it, the manifestly low quality of Arday's work was a huge part of it, which is interesting in part because that's actually not a crime or scandal. That's not, well, it could be a scandal, but it's not necessarily a crime or misconduct in any way, right? I mean, if I write errant nonsense for my next few papers, hopefully I haven't done that in my past papers, but if my next few papers include errant nonsense, I can't be stripped of my tenure for that. Now, if I do gross human subjects violations, or I falsify my research or something like that, then I could potentially be stripped of my tenure for that. So that'd be a misconduct. But writing low quality research is not misconduct per se, but it does kind of make people annoyed. And then on top of that, these things that are just great stories, right? Like all these like things that were not necessarily directly related to his professional career. Although I think part of why Cambridge liked him so much and why he became a favorite celebrity in the UK was because of his falsified personal narrative that fit into the inspirational industrial complex. And so hearing someone who's given very high status tell just like the most absurd lies you've ever heard, and many of them, it's going to get people's attention.
Yeah, this was a kind of a funny story until it turned tragic, right? Because his lies were very outlandish. He was mute until he was 11. He didn't learn to read until he was 18.
A man threatened him with a knife and he didn't call the police.
Right. He just let that guy wander around Cambridge, presumably threatening other people with a knife. And, none of this made any sense. And then, of course, it turned tragic. And I thought about, one of the questions people have been asking over and over is the question I just asked you. Why does this matter? Why are you paying attention to this? Is this the biggest problem in America or in the world today? The answer is no, it's not. And I actually think part of his misfortune was that this came out at the end of July, and August is always a slow news month. And so if something had happened, it would have bumped him off of the front pages, and it wouldn't have been quite as giant a scandal as it turned into. But at the same time, the people who were saying this, many of whom were in academia, were functionally asking, why does it matter that a researcher at Cambridge doesn't do real research? And I thought of stories where there's this kind of compassion that ends up being tragic for the people who are the subjects of it. Since I heard about his death, I've been chewing over the question, as everyone else has been chewing over the question, of who killed him, who made this inevitable. And there's a lot of candidates for that, right? There's Nathan Kaufness, who surfaced the accusations. There is the press. Ibram X. Kendi called it a lynching. Cambridge for doing this. There is Jason Arday himself, who should not have ended in death. And that is tragic. And so the question is, who deserves the lion's share of the blame here?
Well, okay, so there's a sense in which I'm just going to beg off of that and say that I'm not a normative scientist, right? I mean, my job is to say what happens and how it happens, not whether it's right or wrong. But I don't think anybody you listed, whether we're talking about Kaufness or Cambridge or Arday himself, is remotely guilty of the equivalent of murder, right? I'm fine with calling it a public shaming because it actually was a public shaming, but that's a big thing from a lynching, right? Where we actually know a lot about lynching, and lynching is the extrajudicial killing of someone, typically involving torture. That's just a mischaracterization. But I think if we're just thinking in terms of who had a causal role in Arday's death, I think it's all the above, right? That first of all, if Arday himself hadn't misbehaved, there would have been no story there. Even if Arday had been doing low quality research, and even if he had been wildly overplaced for that low quality research, there wouldn't have been the same scandalous angle to it. If institutions in UK higher ed had not first granted him a PhD for lackluster work that had in fact been substantially plagiarized, and then continuously promoted him, were first not only getting him a professor position, but then keep climbing into more and more prestigious universities, he wouldn't have been nearly as newsworthy, right? Somebody at a community college plagiarized his dissertation is not nearly as newsworthy and therefore scandalous as somebody at Oxbridge had plagiarized his dissertation and told a variety of outlandish lies. So that wouldn't have been as big a deal, right? You could still imagine that hypothetical community college professor being fired, but not being the object of sustained international ridicule.
I think there's a reading where this is in some sense a tragedy, right? In the Greek sense, as having been kind of fated once the initial action was taken, right? Jason Arday's academic misconduct, it's small beans, and one could argue that the only person he really hurt is whoever didn't get his job. And Cambridge they're desperate to hire more Black professors for reasons that are understandable and not malicious.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Nathan Kaufness, who may have had revenge as a motive because he was at Cambridge before he was canceled, but who had surfaced genuinely illicit behavior. And as you say, someone else was going to figure this out eventually.
People before him had figured it out. They'd just been effectively deterred.
But eventually it was going to come out, right? It was unlikely that people were just going to keep not noticing, especially because he had this book coming out from Simon & Schuster, and because the stories he was telling kept getting bigger. And it just seems like at the end of the day, the press and the social media might have gone a little overboard, but part of the reason they're going overboard is that there are people who are on the other side who seem to be insisting that it doesn't actually matter whether any of this is true. And so you've just set a course of events that it seemed like it was going to end in something that was disastrous, even if not quite this disastrous.
because there wasn't any other way it could end. And so I wonder, though, if I'm not letting too many people off the hook, if there was some point where this could have been stopped in a better way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if he was just an eccentric, fabulous PE teacher, because that actually was his original specialty, was physical education. If in that happier world, he would be alive and well and husband to his wife and father to his children, and so that there's a plausible world where he was not basically promoted, and I mean that in both senses of the term, promoted above his competence. And so absolutely, if that hadn't happened, things would be great. But I totally agree with you that there is an element in which that's right. I mean, we're talking basically 10 years ago.
Right. Are we going to go back and find his dissertation committee and say, what were you people thinking?
Well, was it yes and no, right? So it's like the dissertation was like 10, 12 years ago. But he was only appointed at Cambridge like 2 or 3 years ago. So that's a relatively recent thing. And I think there are lessons to be learned from that. And I don't think they're just like, dissertation committees should use Turnitin.
Why don't they? Can I actually just pause and ask you that? It seems like it would be trivially easy to check.
So part of it is that there's an immense amount of trust that goes on between faculty and grad students, where there's not really a way for me to validate that my grad students are doing what they said they did. And there wasn't really a way for my advisor to validate that I was doing what I said I did. You kind of have to take that on trust. Now, we could do Turnitin, right? That's something that's technologically feasible. Maybe that'll eventually become standard procedure. I honestly think part of it is because it's not routine. And I don't just mean that in the sense of like, well, nobody ran my dissertation, so why should I run yours? I mean that in the sense of the way academics mostly use Turnitin is that we have a course website, and Turnitin is built into that course website. We usually aren't running papers or other documents through Turnitin one at a time, but it's like if it's not a regular assignment for a class, then it's not routine for us to do things through Turnitin. So I think that's the simple answer as to why we didn't do that. But maybe we should.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that you should. I mean, maybe journalists should too. We have our own regular plagiarism scandals, although we publish at a volume that might make that prohibitively expensive.
So you guys do more than 2 articles a year, right?
Just a few.
Yeah.
Also podcasts now.
Yeah.
So I think this goes to the core of why this becomes a scandal, right? We talked about the prestige of Cambridge, and underneath that prestige is that reputation is what gives Cambridge influence on the world, not just influence on the people in Cambridge, but why we trust them to tell us what the world is like. And that requires that you have a reputation for prioritizing truth and scholarship over anything else, because otherwise, why would I trust you, right? And at the same time, universities are under tremendous pressure to diversify for reasons that I think are laudable in many ways and valid. And so they kind of start compromising the mission, the truth-seeking part, because they're so desperate to diversify fast. It's not just that they are going to slowly, over this like glacial timescale of academic hiring, but they want it to happen right now. And so there's a question I find strangely hard to answer about all of this, which is, did Jason Arday con Cambridge, or were they kind of co-conspirators? Right? The hiring committee, according to the New York Times, contained an autism expert who should have known that his claims about having only learned to speak when he was 11, only learned to read when he was 18, should have known that that's not how autism goes. And it should have inspired some questions about his work, right? But they hire him anyway for a very prestigious position that's supposed to be for the very most top scholars. And so I wonder if it was a con. We had Tyler Austin Harper on the show last week. He's a Black professor who left a tenure-track job at Bates after he became disgusted by the way social justice politics was actually playing out on campus. And one thing he said was that he came to realize that his job on campus was primarily to be Black.
and that if he was a good scholar, that's great. That's a nice bonus, but that wasn't really what he was hired for. And it feels like something similar is happening with Arday, where it's a bonus, but it's not the point. And do you think that's what's going on here?
I would say that there's nothing contradictory. You're asking, did he con them?
You don't know. You weren't in
were
the
they
room,
in on it?
But
No. That's not what I mean. Actually, what I mean is that I don't think there's a contradiction between saying I conned you and you wanted to be fooled, right? I mean, everything we know about con artists is there's the old saying of like you can't con an honest man. That in order to con someone, especially in a long con, not a short con, but especially in a long con, in order to con someone, they have to want something, and they kind of have to want something that maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room about, of like, is it entirely appropriate? But so it's like if you watch like David Mamet films he made in like the 80s and early 90s about con artists, it's almost always the case that it's like, I'm the con artist, you're the mark, and I find out that you're fundamentally greedy, and that maybe you never realized this about yourself, but you're a little willing to cut corners if only someone suggests it to you. And you're willing to cut corners, and you're a little ashamed of it, but you really want to get that money because I convinced you. So it's like, if you really had unimpeachable integrity, it'd be harder to con you. So there's no contradiction there between saying he conned them and they wanted to be conned. In fact, that's almost how it has to work.
So you and I have talked before about obfuscated exchange, the ways that people and institutions structure a disreputable transaction so that no one has to admit that a transaction's happening. And when I first looked at this case, that was the lens I reached for. That Cambridge can't say they just want a Black professor, not necessarily a Black scholar, so the official story has to be that he's a best-in-class scholar as well. And so when they're alerted to problems with the scholarship in 2023, they kind of declined to look because the scholarship was never the thing they were buying. But I want you to push back on me because your obfuscation work is really about hiding that an exchange is occurring at all, right?
Yeah.
Whereas this isn't quite that. There's nothing hidden about paying a professor a salary. So what's the right name for what Cambridge is doing?
Yeah, so just as background, I'm an economic sociologist, and one of my main scholarly interests is when we buy something that we know we're not supposed to. Either it's illegal, it's morally disreputable, it's immoral, whatever. But for some reason we know that this is something that it's okay for me to have, but it's not okay for me to buy it. So the classic example would be prostitution, where it's like, okay, this is something, it's okay to have sex, you're just not supposed to pay for sex. And then one solution people come to for this is they find ways to effectively buy and sell things while pretending they're not. And so in the case of sex, that'd be sugar babies. So you're taking a relationship that is at its nature transactional, right? Somebody is exchanging money or things that are pretty directly commensurable with money with sex. You're not supposed to commensurate money with sex, but you find ways to do it anyway, but you pretend that they're a series of gifts.
Right.
So
cab money.
This is, yeah, exactly. Like, oh, here's cab fare, but I give you 10 times more money than you need.
I've got this apartment in New York City. You know what? We're not even using it. Why don't you stay there for a while?
Yeah, then I can stay there with you when I visit you. That's the kind of thing so that's the kind of thing I study. The Arday thing was not that exactly. In that one of the only legitimate things about this was paying him a salary, right? That's like, it's completely normal, right? I'm willing to admit, in front of the entire Washington Post, YouTube, whatever audience, that I accept a salary from UCLA. And, this may, be on the front page of every newspaper in America tomorrow, but I kind of doubt
in
it. Right?
5 years, this is going to come back to bite you, Gabriel.
Yeah, exactly. When those, the Senate hearings. So, because we think it's completely normal, right? We think a professor's a job. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with paying people for a job. It's completely normal that we'd pay people to teach, do research, do service, etc. So that's not the scandalous part. But where I agree with you that there is some kind of an obfuscation going on, in the sense that you're taking something that is a little bit dubious, right? Now, as you've noted, there could be good reasons for this. And there could be good reasons for wanting to diversify your faculty, or for that matter, there could be good reasons for wanting to have someone who's telegenic and a public intellectual, right? I mean, I don't want to overscribe. As the aforementioned New York Times article mentioned, there were 2 women of color in the shortlist that Cambridge had. So it's not like this
Right.
was their only option to diversify the faculty, even just within this job line. So there had to be something else about him that made him compelling.
Right. Although part of it may just have been that he's charming, right? Is
Yeah,
people,
exactly.
I've seen some references to people being like, no, he was really charming. You know, I met him my first week at Cambridge, and, you know, people in the committee, I believe, also said that he told a really good story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Simon and Schuster thought so. So to get back to the obfuscation question, whatever it was that they were trying to accomplish, whether it was some combination of we want someone who's charming, we want someone who can be a public intellectual, we want to diversify our faculty, probably some combination of those. Those are not what you're supposed to be hiring somebody
Right.
for at a Cambridge position, right? Think of who's the single most famous professor in Cambridge history. It's Isaac Newton, who was a legendary nerd. We know what a big nerd he was centuries later. That's how big of a nerd he was. But he also co-invented calculus. You know, he wrote Principia Mathematica, right? That's what you're supposed to be hiring for. But the thing that actually does kind of remind me of, that I have talked about a bit in my research, is the idea of bundling with status. So one of the ways that you can obfuscate transactions is that you can bundle things. So let's say that I wanted you to blurb my next book, and you thought that the book was terrible, and we both kind of knew that the next book was terrible. But at the same time, I said, "Hey, I don't need my car anymore, and I'll sell you my car for $1." Right?
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with selling a car, and there's nothing wrong with blurbing a book. But if I sell you something for much less than it's worth, and then I ask you for something that you're not supposed to take payment for, implicitly there's kind of a cross subsidization between those two exchange circuits. So
Right.
I propose that this is one way that you can buy and sell status. So status only really exists to the extent that everybody else acknowledges it exists. And so if you openly buy and sell it, it just doesn't work.
And this is the constant, right? There's a whole genre of 19th and 20th century novels about the new money trying to buy its way into the elite.
Yeah, but the thing is, you can't openly do it. You have to do it subtly, right? You have to find ways to do it indirectly, right? So it's like the new money makes massive charitable donations.
I built a museum wing.
I built a museum wing. Mm-hmm. Or the classic one, actually. I mean, again, talking about the UK, a really important phenomenon was dollar princesses. And this is a phenomena basically of the Gilded Age or the late Victorian era, where you had all this new money in the United States, where you had, people built railroads or whatever and became very wealthy in the United States. And then you had these aristocrats in Britain whose lands were no longer as valuable as they had been. And so they were kind of impoverished. And basically you had these rich men in the United States, kind of like the idea of being married into royalty. And you had their daughters who really liked the idea of being married into the aristocracy. And they had a lot of money. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, you had these aristocrats who had titles, but didn't really have a lot of money behind them. And so you would have these rich American heiresses marry into somewhat impoverished British aristocracy families. I mean, this is familiar from the plot of Downton Abbey. I mean, if you're wondering, if you haven't seen it in a while and you watch it, you're like, wait, why does the wife speak with an American accent? It's because she's a dollar princess. And likewise, this was the story. This was the birth of Winston Churchill, right? Jenny Churchill was an American. So that's a case where it's like, now, let's say that I'm a robber baron in 1892 America, and I want a royal title. I can't just go to the King of England and say, I will write you a check to give me a royal title. It doesn't work like that, right? It has to be that you go through a process to buy status. So anyway, so I think that status is something that you can't buy directly. There's lots of indirect ways to buy status, right? We've just listed half a dozen of them. But I think that the Arday thing has something in common with those things.
What level do you think people in Cambridge understood what they were doing? Or is part of this that like you're obfuscating this even to yourself?
In the search committee meeting, I think it would have been unthinkable to admit the trade-offs to themselves. I think that it would have been entirely plausible to say, oh, and we have this benefit that he's, really good for public outreach, and he can be a compelling public intellectual who can provide outreach to the public, or and he has all these benefits for diversity, and he has this charming personal story of overcoming adversity, right? I could imagine people mentioning those as pluses. I think it's almost unthinkable to say explicitly, we're hiring someone who's an intellectual lightweight and seems to have a problem with the truth, but A, B, and C, right? That you can't make explicit. You have to treat it almost as like, oh, here's this great scholar, right? As that notorious BBC clip has it, like, he's the best in the world at what he does, and just as a bonus, like a log nut, icing on the cake, or cherry on the cake, we also get these contributions to diversity. We also get that he's this compelling speaker. We also get that he has this triumph over adversity, inspirational personal story, public intellectual, et cetera, all of that stuff.
So what if universities just did say it plainly? What if they just said, like, we're setting aside some seats and some chairs to change who's represented here, and we will accept a somewhat less decorated CV to do it? I mean, forget feasibility. Would that be healthier than the euphemism? Or does saying it out loud destroy the status? Does it destroy the legitimacy that kind of depends on everyone pretending it doesn't happen?
I mean, I think it would probably be healthier, but I think I think basically both parts of it are right? I think it'd probably be healthier. You might see less distortionary things. I mean, one of my pet theories is that if we were more open about this, we wouldn't have to find proxies for it. But that doesn't really fit his case because...
Yeah, that's one of the things like Tyler Austin Harper complained about, is that you're then expected to do race work because that's what they really wanted, but they couldn't really say that. And so what you do is you create like these cluster hires that are specifically for work about race, rather than getting Black scholars who are doing any of a variety of things, because not every female scholar wants to work on women. Not every Black scholar wants to work on race issues. Not every gay scholar wants to do queer theory. And that by using these proxies, right, they're worse than just saying we would like a Black scholar who does something.
But you can also see the pressure that they're under, right? I mean, what are the incentives they're facing? Where it is a thing that they have a panel and somebody will say, why is this panel all white men? And there's like organized like NGOs and projects and things like that to complain about this. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Where, people might very reasonably resent, why are you using me to check this box rather than relying on me for my expertise or interest on, say, bankruptcy or human extinction literature? Why are you using me to check the black box instead of the person who's thought a lot about human extinction box? But it's like, on the other hand, if they don't check those boxes, they're going to get criticism. So they're under a strong set of incentives to do it.
My Aunt Kathy, who was an early pioneer in the field of security studies, this is in the 60s. So she founded Women in Defense and spent a lot of time writing letters to demand that people put women on their panels, because, like, if you didn't do that, there would never be any women on the panels, right? That women would just be treated as if they didn't belong in the field. And I think this is part of the tension we face here, right? Is there were real historical wrongs. It's hard to just strike the perfect balance. Right? It is hard to fix a problem without going too far in the other direction. And I think that might be the defense they offer. But then the counterpoint is that a system built on do one thing and say another is just fragile by construction, right? And the minute someone forces it into daylight, Cambridge faces a reckoning, because they can either say that plagiarism and fabrication are, in fact, like, yes, within Cambridge's standards, which is a big problem for the institutional mission, both because it communicates internally as well as externally that you don't care about this stuff, or they can throw Arday to the wolves as a con man who fooled them. And actually they did both, right? They tried to say, like, simultaneously, this isn't our fault and you shouldn't, you shouldn't talk about it. Yes. Right?
So I mean, they first stood by him and had this line of, well, he didn't do the dissertation at our university, so that's, I forget the name of the other school, but, it's a Liverpool school's problem, and let them investigate it. And also, the attitude they had was, oh, he'd previously been investigated. And you saw this, by the way, with the Good Law Project, which is the NGO that was his primary defender. They had this very carefully worded language of like, this was previously investigated, and they didn't say, and it was found to be fallacious. They said, and the
Yes.
PhD still stands, right? Which implies, if you read between the lines, of like the previous investigation found that he plagiarized, but they decided it wasn't worth stripping him of his dissertation over.
So there is a respect. I don't understand why this is so necessary. Why people feel this, like, almost this panic to not name what's happening. Right? There is a very respectable argument for affirmative action, for representation, for legitimacy, for just bringing new ideas in, and for righting old historical wrongs. And no one was making that. They just attacking the messenger and calling it a vile smear campaign. Why does the obfuscation end up being defended so much more fiercely than the underlying goal it's supposedly serving?
I think it gets back to this issue of, if you openly award status in order to openly reallocate status, it doesn't count anymore. That if I get that Oscar for special achievements in the field of giving $10 million to the Academy, that's not
Right.
the same as if I get an Oscar for best director. And in the same kind of way, what bothers us is that there are disparities in the ethnic background of our elites. And we want to rectify that. It only really counts if we can say, and it's because there's equal distribution of accomplishments. And so if we put it openly and say, well, this particular person, we gave a line to, even though they were, 80th, you kind of become an elite with an asterisk on your name if we're too
Right.
open about it.
Yeah, it strikes me that people like Nathan Kaufness, who I should say, the reason he was canceled and resigned from Cambridge is that he said that if under a meritocracy, there would be almost no Black professors at Harvard. And it strikes me that people like him and people like Ibram Kendi share a kind of despair that the disparities could ever be rectified.
Yeah.
Right? That it's like both have decided we should give up on that. And the answer of Kaufness is that we shouldn't have Black professors there. And the answer of the people who hired Arday is that we should just hire anyone who is Black. And that strikes me as like a very sad way to view the world.
Yeah, the term of art you're looking for is Afro-pessimism, which is a term that that comes out of critical race theory, but it's like you're saying, it actually overlaps substantially with the race realist folks. Now, they have different underlying models, right? The Afro-pessimist model from CRT basically argues that society is so racist to its core and so completely and thoroughly organized around racial oppression that it's impossible to unravel it. Whereas the race realist guys will say that it's all about the distribution of IQ scores and stuff like that. But they come to the same fundamental conclusion, which is without Herculean effort and continuing efforts on the part of society to remediate things, there will be persistent racial inequality.
Right. And so you get these two sides who are contesting over which of those explanations is allowed to be voiced. And you get Kendi arguing that the press, and other people, he was certainly not the only one, arguing that the press was irresponsible to say the thing that was true about Jason Arday. And look, I can make an argument that there were like a few too many articles, as I say. It really is unfortunate this happened in the middle of the summer when there's just not a lot of other news. And so it probably got more coverage than it would have otherwise. But at the same time, fundamentally as a journalist, I cannot argue that the press is not allowed to say things that are true. I mean, in part because I'll go back to, it's basically the argument is that it actually doesn't matter whether Cambridge scholars are scholars, and that we would be better off not knowing if they aren't. And that's an argument I could make, I guess, if I were very cynical, but it's not an argument I would make if I were working in academia and cared about whether people trusted my institution. And that's not the only time I've seen academics make that kind of argument.
There's a certain mentality that thinks that status can just be endlessly reallocated. And that's fundamentally not how it works, because again, status is based on consensus. And if I don't agree that you're a high status person, then almost by definition, you don't have high status, right? Or rather, if society as a whole doesn't agree that you're a high status person, then almost by definition, you're not a high status person. But there's a mentality that kind of looks at it and says, like, well, status is unequally distributed. We'd like to affect that status distribution, so let's just reallocate it. And the trick is that why that's tempting is that does kind of work in the short run. In the short run,
Right.
you can appoint someone as a Cambridge professor who's not remotely qualified to be a Cambridge professor. You can, change the admissions procedure to a top college, stuff like that. But over time, you're debasing the coinage.
Right. And it seems to me that that there's a lot of the fights of the last 10 years are about who should have status, right? And who deserves more and who has too much. I want to talk a bit about the suicide, because scandals end in suicide with a terrible regularity. I don't want to speculate about Jason Arday's state of mind because none of us can know it, but sociology does have. But I will say one thing, which is that I have been the internet's main character a few times, and it is horrible, and it's especially horrible the first time it happens to you. It's really to feel that number of people screaming at you, to feel very alone, especially as other people often abandon you. It is a terrible thing to happen, and I'm sorry for anyone that happens to. But I want to ask you, sociology does have things to say about why public disgrace and self-destruction often travel together. What are they?
Yeah. So, we don't know what was going through his mind, but I think it's very likely that he faced professional disgrace, widespread criticism, and, was shamed by that. And that's very hard to go through. And it's not just hard to go through in the sense of like, okay, I'm finding it difficult to accept this now, but in a week, this story will be over and people complain about something else. But also, I think he kind of rationally understood that his career was over and that whatever he was going to be doing in a year, it wasn't going to be being a professor at Cambridge or anything remotely like it. So I think that there's that sense of like, when I have this high status and this high lifestyle, and basically I'm doing well, and then I have a sudden crash in it, even if there's not professional shame, even if there's not widespread shame that goes along with that, that's still very hard to take. And it's hard to imagine, like, do I want to live if I'm not? Now, obviously the answer is yes, you should want to live. But
yes,
it's understandable that people would sometimes think it's unthinkable that I could live with a much worse lifestyle, much worse social standing that I had 5 minutes ago. And so that's pretty straightforward. The thing that I think is a little bit more interesting is not why I suspect he did it, but why I suspect he didn't do it, but has nonetheless been an emergent property. So Jason Manning, a sociologist at West Virginia, he has this model of what he calls aggressive suicide, which is, so if you go back to like one of the founding works of sociology is Durkheim's Suicide. And Durkheim was trying to explain suicide not as an individual event, but as a collective one, where the idea being that suicide is in part about your social situation. It's about your understanding of yourself. And he talked about, you have anomic suicide, which is where you feel that society has no meaning, life has no meaning, you lack social support. There's altruistic suicide, which is when you're doing something heroic. Ancient Rome had altruistic suicide. India, for many periods in its history, China, basically all of Asia, had concepts of altruistic suicide for long periods. Egoistic suicide, right? So we had all these different concepts of suicide. So Manning adds this concept of what he calls aggressive suicide, which he doesn't use this example, but my favorite example of this is if you read Livy and you go back to the founding of the Roman Republic. How did the monarchy fall, according to Livy, and how did the Roman Republic happen? Well, according to Livy, the son of the reigning monarch, Tarquin, raped a noblewoman, Lucretia, And then after the rape, Lucretia goes to her family, says what happens, and kills herself. And she explicitly calls on the aristocrats of Rome to avenge her death by pushing out the Tarquins. And so, here's a model
Right, and the
of
core of
someone.
this story is that he expected her to keep quiet because she would have been so dishonored by the rape. But by killing herself, she proves, right, that she is very serious about this, that she has been dishonored, is my understanding
And
of that
not only
story.
that, but her family and her family friends, take this up, right? And there's an echo of this centuries later, in that the main avenger of Lucretia was Brutus, and his namesake centuries later, and his descendant, was one of the conspirators against Caesar. So, which is very symbolically resonant for the Romans. So anyway, so you have this suicide, which is not, I'm sure that Lucretia was very upset that she'd been raped, but the point was not, I don't want to live anymore. If that was the case, she would have killed herself privately.
Right.
The reason she killed herself in front of the entire Roman aristocracy was in order to provoke them into taking revenge against the Tarquins. So Manning talks about this idea of aggressive suicide, which is a suicide that is designed to encourage your supporters to take revenge against your enemies. And again, I don't think Arday was doing this. I think Arday, I'm not a psychologist, but my hunch is that Arday simply was very upset by the being humiliated and losing his job and losing all prospects of a similar job in the future. But it nonetheless had that effect, in that other people have been interpreting it that way and basically saying, we have to stand up for him ex post. And it did kind of turn the narrative around, where, there was a period where it's like, why are these racists accusing Arday? Then there was a period where it's like, why is Cambridge not fired this liar yet? And then it turned around to being, why did everyone overreach so much? Why did they push him so much? What's a little plagiarism? Who cares? How did it affect you personally for him to plagiarize his dissertation? Was it worth handing man to death? That became the narrative, and that still is the narrative at the time of this recording.
I want to lean into that for a minute, because I think that there is a grain of truth. Look, he didn't belong at Cambridge, but this also was not the crime of the century, right? And so let me put the counterfactual to you, right? We can't go back to when he was a PE teacher, but say someone brings the evidence privately to Cambridge. Cambridge quietly separates him. There's
yeah.
Well, but
yeah.
Arday lands somewhere softer. What's wrong with that ending, and why didn't it happen? Because they did, and that's not what happened.
Well, I think all of us would prefer if that's what happened, right? That if he had quietly left, and ideally left academia, because it's not like, I don't know, Leeds deserves to have a fabulist, but I think everybody would prefer that he left quietly and did something productive and honorable somewhere else, and maybe was a little sad about it for a bit and then got over it. That'd be a much nicer world. But it didn't happen, and I think it didn't happen basically because Cambridge and Arday personally were too stubborn to handle this gracefully when the accusations first came up, right? It's tempting to think about him as a victim because he's dead, but we constantly have to remember that there were multiple times where he faced accusations and he became very aggressive. He called the police. He got a libel lawyer. He made ethics complaints, whatever, right? So this is not somebody who was going to accept, okay, you got me. Can I just finish the term and I'll go get a job at a high school somewhere?
So that leads into one of my closing questions as we try to land this plane. Does this force universities into a deeper look at a bunch of things? That's all moot anyway, but they should probably also be checking for AI. Does it affect how they do diversity, or does everyone wait for the news cycle to end and just go back to equilibrium?
I think there are much bigger factors that will affect how universities do diversity than this scandal, right? I mean, there have been plenty of scandals of white scholars who've fabricated their research, plagiarized, whatever. So I wouldn't want to overgeneralize from this case and maybe a handful of other cases to say that this is substantially about diversity. I think there's other factors, not least among them. I mean, you have the vibe shift, right? You have the end of the Great Awakening and the cultural backlash to the Great Awakening. And then you have the Trump administration waging total war on higher education because it's so upset about a lot of the things that higher education did during the Great Awakening. Those are the things that are going to lead to a rethinking of diversity efforts much more than, a few cases that involved academic misconduct, which, like I said, is not coterminous with this. There's plenty of people who do crazy woke research completely honestly. And there's plenty of people who do normie research in a way that they fake, So dishonestly. So I wouldn't want to conflate these issues too much.
Well, does it make people rethink how they do academic integrity? Right. Which, I mean, I think we would both agree is a larger issue and strikes much more deeply at the core of what the university does. And a lot of people will say, like, look, there are people who've done sexual harassment, whatever it is, and they were white and they were powerful and no one held them to account, or it took an absurdly long time for them to be held to account.
Mm-hmm.
Does this move the needle on that?
If this happened before AI, I would say yes, because one of the nice things about plagiarism is that it's relatively easy to detect and validate. And you can, it's relatively easy to find the source document. Even if I changed, a few words here and there, you could still find the source document, use fuzzy matching. And then you can show beyond any doubt that I copied that. When it comes to using AI, if I ask Claude to write something for me, Pangram can show you that it's suspicious, but it can't prove that I used AI for that. Like if I have a lot of M dash, guess what? I've been using M dashes since before, the transformer neural network architecture existed. People use M dashes.
Using
right?
and abusing, my editors would say. I have been, not you.
So AI detection is probabilistic in a way that's not true for plagiarism detection. And given that it's easier to have an AI cheat for you, even if you're not worried about getting caught, it's just simply easier to have an AI fill in the paragraph than it is to find a source document that says what you're trying to say and then copy paragraphs from it. I think plagiarism is largely going to be a thing of the past because AI basically replaces that use case. Anthropic has announced they're going to start watermarking Claude's output. So if the other AI labs agree to do that, then that could provide a solution. But that's only if the cheaters, the cloud-based proprietary AIs, and don't switch to the
Chinese open weight model.
The Chinese open source AIs, right?
So my last question, this show is called Reasonably Optimistic, and we try to earn both words here. What should we hope for out of this story?
I think what we can hope for is that universities have hiring procedures that are not about let's chase the shiny object, right? They're not about let's meet this priority without paying attention to what the disciplines value. I'm a big fan of academic disciplines, and I think discipline's an appropriate word. It's not just a synonym for field or specialty, right? And like we refer to like our time in graduate school as training. Like I was trained at Princeton. I would usually say I was trained at Princeton, not I went to graduate school at Princeton or I got my PhD at Princeton. Training, discipline, right? We use these words deliberately. And I think that if we put more emphasis on the disciplines and what they value, especially those disciplines that have shown themselves able to govern themselves. But even if you do think that a discipline is in need of reform or in need of adult supervision, that needs to be done in concert with the discipline itself to draw on what's good about that discipline. And I think one of the things that's troubling about this case and one of the things that could be rectified is that it seems like there wasn't that much involvement from the social department. And if you had more reliance on not just experts who are experts in other things, but experts who are experts in the field and in the discipline, and are given permission to prioritize their professional perspective rather than other broader needs of the university, you can have better hiring come out of that.
That is indeed hopeful. Gabriel Rossman, thank you so much for being with us.
All right, thank you.